essentially, because that's one of the things we've learned, regrettably, in the last couple of years, the speed with which people can move themselves to violence. It starts with words, and that's why I think that the political dispute that we've had in Australia, really ending last year, but starting, probably you could date it to 2011, where one side of Australian politics decided to rip up what had been bipartisan support for anti-vilification laws in Australia. It's got quite a long history. The Labor government in 1994, Attorney General Lavarch under Paul Keating, following on a really excellent report done by the late Ron Caston back in 1991-92, which said that in addition to the racial discrimination legislation that we brought in Australia in 1975, we should have anti-vilification laws. Many other countries have them, and the result of that work that Ron Caston did with Irene Moss, there were similar recommendations in the Black Deaths in Custody Royal Commission report, and some work done by the Law Reform Commission, led to the passage in 1994, came into effect at the start of 1995, what is now known as Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act. And what that law is a prohibition which has civil consequences. It doesn't have criminal consequences, it has civil consequences. It's a prohibition on speech which humiliates, offends, insults a member of the Australian community. It's proved to be a law which hasn't been used with tremendous frequency. In other words, we haven't had thousands and thousands of complaints under this law, but there have been hundreds each year since it became law in Australia in 1995, and some of those complaints have been from the Jewish community, and some of them have resulted in findings upheld, because the way it works is you go to the Human Rights Commission. The Human Rights Commission attempts to conciliate between the complainant and the person that's vilified, and if no resolution is possible, it goes off to the federal court. And the federal court has on a number of occasions said that Holocaust denial is anti-Semitic speech and infringes this law. It's been useful. There's a lot of Western countries that don't have laws against Holocaust denial. There's a lot of Western countries, including the United States, that don't have a law that you can invoke to say, excuse me, turn that off, to say that this is beyond the standard that our community expects. And having had this experience for nearly 20 years, it was a surprise to me. This law survived the Fraser government. It was entirely endorsed by the Howard government, so it survived quite long periods of Conservative government in Australia. But surprisingly to me, in 2011, from opposition, the Conservative parties in Australia decided that they were going to promise to repeal this law. I didn't think they were serious, because it's a law that served Australia very well. I particularly didn't think they were serious when in 2012, Julia Gillard, as Prime Minister on behalf of the Labor government, was the first Australian politician to sign something called the London Declaration Against Antisemitism. And the Conservative politicians in Australia followed suit. They all signed up. And I thought that might be the end of this promise to repeal Section 18C, but it wasn't to be. They came to government, and we then spent the better part of a year with very many ethnic communities across Australia standing side by side to say to the government, that's not the kind of Australia we want to have. I found it a very heartening political experience, unlike almost anything I've experienced in the 8 years I've been in federal parliament, because it got me to stand on or sit on platforms with a whole range of ethnic community leaders, notably Randa Kattan, who's the chair of the Arab Council of Australia. So I did a number of speaking engagements with her, as did Peter Wertheim. who's the executive director of the ECAJ, and it was terrific to be there in this alliance with a group that's not historically been aligned to the Jewish community, and so too there were a whole range of other ethnic communities that again have some historical enmities, but decided that they would put those enmities to one side in the interests of saying to the Australian government, we want this law. We want there to be a continuing law against vilification in Australia. And in August last year, the government announced that it was dropping this attempt to repeal Section 18C. I've gone on at length about that because I happen to think that things that come from the community, laws that deal with behaviour in the community generally, are at least as important as any kind of law enforcement tool, as any kind of hardening of our security agencies or hardening of the building fabric in which we conduct our schools or our synagogues or our community organisations. I think that those softer measures, those measures that actually talk about and go to what kind of Australia we want to have, where the whole community says we stand against racism, we stand against vilification, we're not prepared to have anyone in our community vilified, and we are going to set a standard, and more than that, we are happy to have a law which sets that standard. Now, having said that, I thought I'd speak about some of the specific measures that might be thought to be directly related to the Jewish community, and then move on to talk a little bit about the way I think that security has to be approached, because very much, while it's true that there are specific threats that have to be acknowledged, that the Jewish community is regarded as being, along with a range of other communities, don't feel that it's only the Jewish community in Australia that security agencies think is under threat in some ways. Really, community security is about the whole of the community. It's not just about any particular group. Recognising that there was a particular threat to Jewish schools, when Labor came to office at the start of 2008, after the 2007 election in November, we set about implementing what had been a promise made at the 2007 election, which was something called secure schools. Who here went to a Jewish school? Just about everybody. In that case, because every single Jewish school in Melbourne has benefited from the Secure Schools program. You may or may not know what has been done at the school that you attended, but they were things like, it's in truth, it's what the security people call hardening. It's where you put grill work on the Carlisle Street frontage of Beth Rivka. It's where you, on the windows, because it's very close to the street. It's where you put anti-vehicle drive-up devices outside a number of schools so that people cannot drive a vehicle, in an unauthorised vehicle anywhere close to the school. It's building serious fencing, as has now occurred at a number of schools. All of that, I was one of the people that dreamed up this Secure Schools program. I was very pleased to see it implemented after the 2007 election. We put more money into it after the 2010 election, and at the 2013 election both parties embraced it, so that not only is there continuing money for capital works programs at every Jewish school in the country, but there's recurrent funding as well, because one of the issues of course has been about how to pay for. It's an additional burden that I don't think that Jewish schools should have to bear, because I think everyone going to every school in Australia has a right to be safe. There's additional money that's been given on a recurrent basis that goes to assisting schools with security guards. I can say to you that it was a surprise to me in government. I had assumed that the Secure Schools program would go almost wholly, if not wholly, to Jewish schools. But because it's not open to an Australian government to announce a community-wide program and say it's only for Jewish schools, this was a program that was designed and specified for schools that were experiencing some kind of security risk. And much to my surprise, a government school in southern Sydney, in southwest Sydney, which was experiencing some pretty intense Shia on Sunni violence in the school, applied for and got a grant under the Secure Schools program. A Muslim school in my own electorate, which is in south east Melbourne here, the particular schools in Keysborough, had received quite a number of threats. It felt that it's a Turkish school, it felt that its premises weren't sufficiently secure. They applied for and got funding for a reasonably substantial fence that now surrounds the school, which is to be welcomed, because it's not to be welcomed that any school in Australia would feel under threat because of a threat of ethnic or sectarian or racist violence, but if those threats are there, it's appropriate that the Australian government step in and say we're going to make sure that schools are as secure as possible. More broadly, what you've seen really since 2011, 9/11 in 2001, the events in New York, is an increased threat level in Australia. I wish I could say to all of you that we do not have an increased threat level of a terrorist event occurring here in Australia, but we do. There is no agreement anywhere in the world about how to deal with, how to respond to that kind of increased threat level. I waver a bit about how much we should talk about increased threat levels, partly because it alters the way in which we see our world if we're always talking about threat levels, partly because it plays into those who would commit acts of terrorism to talk about those acts of terrorism. That is what terrorists want. Those that want to disrupt our community want their acts of terror and the threat of their acts of terror to disrupt our community. They want us to spend time worrying about it. They want everybody to be concerned, and that's why I waver a bit about between wanting to talk about it, because I think it's appropriate that everybody in the community understand that there is a threat and it's real, but on the other hand, knowing that to talk about it too much plays into the hands of those who want their actions to create terror. But recognising that there is a threat, we've had really nearly 15 years of increased powers in a whole range of ways being given to both the Australian Federal Police and state and territory police forces. I'd have to say I think that most of those powers are appropriate. I think that we do need to keep them under review, but I think that when you are facing what is in truth quite a difficult threat, which involves small groups of people, very small groups of people, but people within the Australian community wishing to do acts of harm to other people in the Australian community. They're not coming from outside. It's not really a threat that can be dealt with by customs or border control. It's not really a threat that can be dealt with by the armed forces. It's a threat that has to be dealt with by police work. And in order for the police and the intelligence agency, which is primarily ASIO, to be able to do their work, you have to look at whether or not some additional powers might need to be given to those agencies. That has in fact occurred. I'm in favour of keeping them under review. I think that they need to be seen as extreme powers and therefore reviewed on a continuing basis. There's additional powers, there's additional resources that can be given to police and the security agencies. And again, if you are trying to get ahead, if you are trying to make sure that you know in advance of people who are plotting to commit some act of terror, it's a very labour-intensive work. It requires there to be men and women employed by the Federal Police, employed by Victoria Police, employed by ASIO, whose job it is to engage in intelligence gathering and try to find out ahead of the event, any event being perpetrated, what is happening. Happily, we can point in Australia to some success. We've been able to prevent a planned attack on Holsworthy Army Barracks in 2008. We've been able to prevent a planned bombing of a major sporting event in Melbourne, also in 2008. And through the course of 2009, 2010, there was some quite major trials conducted, and there now are people in respect of both those plots serving lengthy terms of imprisonment in Australian jails. Regrettably not long enough in some cases, because at least one of the people who was involved in the Melbourne plot, which was called Operation Pendennis, they're the group of people that were associated with someone in Preston called Ben Breaker, received shorter sentences, and one of them's now in Syria, having served only 4 years in his term of imprisonment, and he went off to Syria. There's a whole range of cooperation between federal agencies and state and territory agencies. That's the primary role of the federal government. It's an appropriate role. We're a federation. Policing is done in Australia by the state and territory police forces. It's not possible to have any law enforcement activity in Australia that is not done at the state and territory level, but equally there's a very valuable role that can be played by the federal government in coordinating work across Australia, providing national intelligence. It's the national government that's got the links overseas. It's the national government that in particular has got this Five Eyes arrangement with the other English-speaking countries, the US, Canada, New Zealand, Britain, yeah, the UK. We do share intelligence with those countries, and the federal government, through its agencies, is able to disseminate that information as needed to state and territory police forces. All of that's a good thing. I'll finish by talking about another aspect that I think is important, partly because I went to the US the week before last to talk to the US Attorney General and US police and intelligence agencies about this subject. It goes by the name of countering violent extremism. And it's something that's difficult to engage with. It's difficult even to talk about usefully, but it's something I'm certain needs to be done, and everybody else seems certain it needs to be done. It's really the proposition that you can't hope to prevent radicalisation of every single person in your community. You can't hope to prevent people from deciding to join up with some Salafist jihadist group because they're hunched over their computer screen and decide, without talking to anyone here in Melbourne or in Sydney or Brisbane, that this is the way they wish to engage with the world. You can't hope to deal with every single person in that category by law enforcement methods. It's not enough to give more powers to the police. It's not enough to give more resources to the police. To my mind, and I think there's some level of agreement right across Australia about this on both sides of the political divide, it needs to operate at a level of community engagement. So I go back to what I was talking about at the start. Just as it's important to have laws which set standards about the way in which we speak, the way in which we engage in political debate, I think it's also important that there be effort at the community level, recognising, to just give a simple example, it's at least as likely that someone's mother is going to be the first person to notice that their son is going down the path of deep interest in Salafist jihadism. It's as likely to be that person's mother as any other person in the world. And the German government has got a program that works with mothers in the Muslim community that says, we're going to arm you with tools to work with your son. We're going to give you some resources, someone to go to talk to, someone you can call that might be able to come in and assist. And I'm very, very interested. We've only scratched the surface of it here in Australia. In the counter-terrorism white paper in 2010, as a government, we said we are going to engage in countering violent extremism strategies. They took the form of a whole range of really small grants to a whole lot of community organisations. Almost all of them went to the Muslim community. A couple of grants went to some Tamil community organisations, but the threat of violence stemming from the Tamil community is fading, I hope, almost to the point of invisibility. It's very much about working in the Muslim community. On the change of government in 2013, the new government said it wasn't going to do any of this. I've complained about this, and I'm very happy to say, and I welcomed it publicly, the Abbott government has decided it is going to re-engage in this area. We haven't actually seen much yet. One of the reasons I went to the United States the week before last is because they are far more advanced. Following on the Boston bombing, for example, of which we've just had the second anniversary on the 15th of April. Boston Police, the municipal authorities in Boston, and the Governor of Massachusetts all embarked madly on the idea that they would engage with their Muslim communities. The New York Police Department have been doing this kind of community engagement work for very many years. I'm happy to say that Victoria Police, through community liaison officers, who are officers that you barely recognise as police, but they are police. They tend to wear polo shirts and not be armed and go and organise sporting events, things like that. The work's happening, but it's pretty embryonic. I'm hoping that we can do more of it. I think there's a role for the federal government in leading the way, not necessarily doing it, because it has to be done at a local level, and you're going to get municipal authorities, community groups, local mosques, local police officers more likely to actually engage on that hands-on basis. But I'm hoping that in the coming months and over the next couple of years, we're going to see greater effort at building an environment where if someone is about to go down this path and present a risk or engage in a violent act, someone will say something, someone will do something, someone will reach out to that person and be able to provide some guidance. At the point at which 200 police officers are conducting raids in Hallam and Narre Warren South and knocking down doors at 3 in the morning, it's actually a bit too late because the people concerned are too far down the track. They've already plotted, they've already planned. Getting them back from that point's a great deal more difficult than if they're just starting to think about it. So I'll leave you with that thought. I'm really happy to answer questions. Hope I haven't depressed you all by it is a difficult topic, you know, but I think we have to engage with it. I don't think putting your head in the sand and saying it's not real works. So I'm for talking about it, but I'll leave you with a positive note and say we're doing pretty well in Australia. Thanks to God, we have not had a terror event in Australia of any scale. I exclude the Martin Place siege. I don't really count that as a terrorist event. The guy was a nutter who decided halfway through this crazy and murderous behaviour that he would call for an ISIL flag. I don't think that really counts as a planned act of terror. The one that you could say is a borderline terrorist act is Newman Hyder here at the Endeavour Hills Police Station, which was the event on the 23rd of September last year. You probably recall it because it made the front page of the Herald Sun 6 days in a row. There's a completely disaffected young man, 17 years old, lived in Australia since he was 2. His father has a degree, Afghan family, his father's got a degree from Adelaide University. His 3 brothers, one of them studies here, is studying pharmacy, all totally integrated into Australia. He himself totally integrated, playing cricket, and yet something happened and he took a knife and went to murder an Australian Federal Police officer and a Victoria Police officer and was shot dead himself. I have to count that as an act of terror because the motivation for it was to create something that struck fear into the hearts of our community. But it's not a large number of events, and I hope that continues. Anyway, you've got a question.
You said that the program is first in Germany. How long has that program been around, and is there any results from it?
Yeah, it's called, I mean, it's notoriously difficult to measure the outcomes of any of these programs. It's very easy to play populist politics and say that program failed, or this program failed, or that program produced no measurable result, because you're trying, it's measuring a negative. You're actually, success is the absence of a terror event. Success is the absence of someone resorting to violent extremism. And it's been going about 3 years. It's called Hayat, and yeah, it's a program that's ongoing. The British have got a whole range of programs. They've got a much larger Muslim community. There's 4.5 million Muslims in the UK living in a much more ghettoised situation than our Muslim community here in Australia, which is much more dispersed, and that's a very good thing. And in the United States, the people in the US, from the Attorney General down, all asserted to me that they're doing something right, because they've had far fewer people go to fight as foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq from the United States, despite the size of their community. Extraordinarily, here in Australia, on a pro rata basis, we've had far more than any Western country other than Belgium. I wish I knew why. So we've had, at last count, about 130 young Australians have gone to fight in Syria or Iraq. That's in the last 3 years. It's a hugely greater number than went to participate in Afghanistan to join up with Al-Qaeda or Lashkar-e-Taiba in Afghanistan, which was less than 30 for the entire 10 years of the conflict. It's 130 in the past 3 years. But as to measurable results, I don't know of any. The German authorities say they're pleased with the way the program's gone. But yeah, your measurement would be there hasn't been an act of violent extremism. Yeah.
The recent raids resulted in the Victorian Police using their preventative detention powers. What's your opinion? Do you believe that these powers go too far in? And as well, what do you think the repercussions the exercise of those powers would have on the sentiment within the Muslim community in general, especially?
Yeah, this is the great question that we've conferred on our police forces powers that are not to be found anywhere in the English-speaking world. The power that this question relates to is a thing called a preventative detention order, which the police can use to detain someone for up to 14 days without charge, which is at odds with the common law system of 300 years, where you don't get detained unless you are charged and you get brought before a court to have a chance to get bail. This is a no bail, no release. You are detained for up to 14 days, during which time you can't be charged and the investigation stops. There's no agreement among Australian police forces about the usefulness of these. It sounds like a great idea at one level. Great, we can reach in and we can grab that person and prevent them from doing whatever it is. You'd only use it if you feared that they were about to do something. They can be kept in secret. They can be kept in a way that they can't talk to anyone. So it is, in truth, a really extreme power and unusual in the Australian legal system. Review was conducted in late 2012 and another review in early 2013. The first review was conducted by a retired New South Wales Court of Appeal judge called Tony Wheely for COAG. The second review was conducted by the Independent National Security Legislation Monitor, who's a reviewer of these kinds of laws that we set up in 2010. Both of them said this power should be abolished. And the election intervened. I was Attorney General, so it was I started to think about this. And the COAG review was particularly interesting because it was a committee of senior police officers. There was a dissenting report from one of the senior officers saying he thought this power was useful, but the rest of the senior officers said, no, get rid of it. It actually interferes with the course of investigations. When we passed a bill, we voted in favour of a bill from opposition last year in October that extends this power. We argued with the government that it should only be for another 4 years, in other words a sunset provision, and be reviewed. So that's the best I could do at the time, and it will be reviewed in about 3 years' time. And the jury's a bit out on whether, as I say, it's easy to do populist politics in this area. It's easy to say more powers, more resources for the law enforcement agencies. But I actually invite everyone to think a bit harder about what might work, and this is one I'm bothered by.
Hi. I just wanted to ask about the way that I guess the Muslim community and maybe others in the broad left have responded to some of these terror raids by saying that the nature in which they've been conducted has actually fed into fears in the Muslim community and potentially even are exacerbating the problem of extremism and the problem of, I guess, some young Muslims feeling like the West is out to get them, I suppose. Do you think the right balance has been achieved, or?
I don't think the right balance has been achieved in some of the public language that's being used in Australia at the moment. I think there's an incredibly large responsibility on senior political figures to talk about this in a way which is inclusive of the whole community. But the raids, I support whatever the police decide to do. And the problem here is that for police, the risk of a weapon being present, the risk of a violent response to them going in to arrest someone, is the same as certain knowledge that there is a weapon or weapons at the other end, certain knowledge that their visit to the house will be resisted. They have to gear up on a basis of risk. And if the police have made a decision that they need to go in numbers, I'm not going to argue with that. But that operational decision having been made, it's exceptionally important that all senior political leaders talk about this in the right way. I'm not sure that we need to have prime ministerial press conferences about a piece of police activity in southeast Melbourne. I am certain, and I'm try not to be too party political, but every now and again it escapes me. And I have been very concerned about some of the language that the Prime Minister has chosen to use, and I'd single out something that he said in a set-piece speech about 6 weeks ago, where he used these phrases. Islam is a religion of peace. I wish more Muslim leaders would say that and mean it. Now, I invite all of you to contemplate if the Prime Minister of Australia said that about Judaism, or indeed Christianity, you'd take offence, because the direct implication is Muslims are not to be trusted, among other things. It's got another implication which is false, which is Muslim leaders have not been saying that, they have, and it's got an implication that Muslim leaders have not been doing enough in their own communities, and they have. And it's caused tremendous pain in the Muslim community, and I know this directly because I've been talking to people in the Muslim community about how they feel that the efforts that they are making, and I'll just digress for a moment to point out that if you're a senior Muslim cleric, if you're an imam at a big mosque, if you're a senior figure in the community, you will be just as perplexed at how to reach the 18-year-old hunched over his or her computer screen as I am, or as anybody, any senior leader anywhere in Australia is. It's not different for senior Muslim leaders. They're just as scratching their heads about this, but they have been working at this. They have been trying. And I actually think we have to be much more careful than the Prime Minister has been recently in talking about this, and try to make some distinctions. Senior political leaders in the States have been working pretty hard at this. They have a different narrative in the US which works better for them. They've got a Bill of Rights which very directly protects people, very directly says we are a secular country, very directly protects freedom of speech. they've got another economic narrative which works very well for them, the American dream. And taken together, I think it gives a better setting for working with Muslim communities than where we've got to so far. But I think we can always try harder and always do better. I'm certain that working with Muslim communities is the answer, and I'm certain that we're going to get our best protection and greater security from work done in the Muslim community. Top down is too late. Law enforcement we need, resources we need for our agencies and our police, but once you are at that point, you've already got a bunch of radicalised people prepared to engage in violence. I'm wanting to stop them getting to that point. Yeah.
With the power of the language that's being used at the moment, and sort of like that phrase that you mentioned from the Prime Minister, what role do you think the media should be portraying or playing in sort of putting out particular images or the way that they speak about terror in terms of sort of reporting the facts, but also in giving the terrorists what they want and striking fear into the hearts of Australians and things like that?
I'm for much more care. I didn't think that the Herald Sun should have run 6 front pages in a row about Niran Haider. This is a 17-year-old kid about to turn 18 who's gone mad in a way. It's a shocking event that he should arm himself with a knife. It's completely out of our experience of crime, our experience of events here in Australia. But it doesn't warrant 6 days in a row front page of the main tabloid paper in Australia. There's a degree of intrusiveness, for example, of sending a photographer to photograph the funeral. What was that about? Of course people are grieving. I've met with his dad, so it's personal for me in a sense. I've come to understand the shock to that family of their youngest son of 4 going crazy, something of which they had no knowledge, no real inkling, and from about to do his VCE to dead in the space of a 24-hour period, it was beyond bearing, you'd have to think. Now, I don't think anyone was assisted, and I don't think relations with the Muslim community were assisted much by the way in which the media chose to write it up. And in particular, insisting, I know I've said it's to some extent it's got terrorist implications because of the nature of the event, but I think we should be wary about describing it as some major terrorist or terror event when it's in truth not. It's about how to strike the balance of the way in which we talk about this. All in all, it is difficult to talk about. The whole area is difficult to talk about, including how to talk publicly about the need to engage with the Muslim community, because it undermines the work. The more government figures talk about working with the Muslim community, in some senses, the more difficult it is for respected Muslim leaders to engage. It's a bit of a conundrum. Yep.
Would you then say, in the context of it being important to take community action and prevent it, would you see then no real scope to make the Section 18C, was it, offence more of a criminal sphere?
We've already got a criminal offence of incitement to racial violence. It's been part of the criminal code for the same amount, for the same 20-year period. It was brought in. Ron Caston's review recommended that there be a civil breach, which leads to compulsory conciliation and into the federal court and orders made, potentially with compensation order, but at the same time putting in a specific incitement to racial violence or racially motivated violence offence in the criminal code, which appears in the Commonwealth Criminal Code. Not every state has it. And it's actually quite a difficult criminal offence to prove, but it's there, it's on the Commonwealth Statute book already. I'm getting the wind up from Nobby. I've got another 5 minutes. Take it away. One more. Yeah.
Going a little globally out. So Australia, because with ISIS, they have to cooperate with a lot of other countries because it is, a global conflict. What's your view on Australia cooperating with countries, such as other Arab countries that themselves have human rights abuses?
we're in this, no, we're in this terrible territory. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. You have to cooperate sometimes with countries that, for certain purposes, even though they're countries that you don't approve of their other foreign policy, you don't approve of their lack of human rights internally. We've got a series of protocols that is designed to prevent ASIO or the Australian Federal Police knowingly receiving information that's been obtained by torture, because we are against torture in all its forms, but the mere fact that human rights standards in a particular country with whom we are dealing are not our standards or are too low is not, we've never said that's a reason to not deal with that country at all. I'm pretty worried about the idea of any kind of intelligence cooperation with Iran, believe me. But the government's embarked on it and have said we've got a limited common interest, very limited. We've got a limited common interest with Iran in fighting ISIL, so we're going to cooperate. I suspect we'll never know much about that, and I'm bothered by it. But equally, I accept that for the purpose of gathering intelligence, sometimes you've got to deal with people that you don't like that much.